Just pop our screen up there. Our next session today is a presentation and panel discussion on how to get started on your first-party data strategy. The retirement of the third-party cookie presents significant opportunities for marketers to gain competitive advantage if they can take control of their first-party data and make it as comprehensive and usable as possible. This session is going to be moderated by our own IAB tech lead, Jonas Jaanimagi. JJ is going to introduce you to our wonderful panel of experts here today, who are going to take us through the steps to building and gaining value from privacy-compliant first-party data sets. Welcome, JJ.
Thank you. Thanks, Nat. How are you doing?
Great.
Marvellous. Well, thank you very much. Yes, this Festival of Measurement continues with this session, how to get started on your first-party data strategy. And I've got a wonderful lineup of participants here. Thank you in advance to all of you for joining us. In fact, for once, we've got Melburnians outnumbering those from Sydney, which is a rare delight. Matt, Sarah, and myself are all from Melbourne. So we have Angelo, Sydney-based, Director of Data Products at 9. He sits in our Data Council. Sarah's joining us from Kraft, Heinz. Thank you in advance. We've got a VIP guest from the US in the form of Alex Cohn, who I have the great privilege of chatting to every couple of weeks or so. He's a Senior Director of Product Management there, but also one of the main leads on Project Rearc, and he's a very busy chap right now, I can tell you. And also we have Matt Bruty joining us from Digital Balance. So we will be going into a panel. Before that, we'll have a presentation from Matt. And please do send through the questions that you have to us on the Q&A, and I'll try and seamlessly weave it into the questions that I've got for the team here. But for now, I'm going to hand over to you, Matt, to get us going with your presentation on how cookies work and why they're relevant. So please take it away, Matt, and then we'll jump back into the panel.
Perfect. Cheers, Jonas. Thank you very much. Morning, everybody. So let's get things kicked off here. So I'm Matt from Digital Balance, and we are a digital and data, digital and data strategy consultancy based in Melbourne. We also have offices in Perth and in Sydney. We specialize in data and analytics and optimization and personalization. And my role as solution architect is to design and deliver solutions that can support our clients' long-term objectives, often by making the most of what they already have and identifying gaps and making recommendations accordingly. Now, as you might well imagine, over the last year or so, the rate of change in areas around data governance and data restrictions has really started to ramp up and is keeping us very busy. So I thought it'd be a good idea to kick off this session just by understanding some of the history and driving force about why first-party data strategies are such a hot topic at the moment, to understand why we're all here. And to that end, I'm going to talk through a bit of a scene setting exercise by way of some common cookie use cases, some misconceptions that we hear from clients and in the industry, highlight the impact of some of these changes, and then round off with a few thoughts on where you might want to start focusing your efforts in terms of building out a first-party data strategy. So first up is looking at how cookies work and why they're relevant. So the first thing to note is a cookie is just a way of storing something in a browser. That's all it is. Keep a little bit of information, a bit of text in the browser. And they started off as a very simple way for websites to remember something about you. Before cookies came along, if you're on a website and you go from one page to the next, it couldn't remember anything about you. So if you, on an e-commerce website, put something in your basket, by the time you get to the next page, it's forgotten that fact. So this was a very useful piece of functionality that came along to help assist with that. But people very quickly realized that you could use this ability to store information about what people are doing across multiple websites. So for example, you could have a number of sites that are all operating Facebook marketing technology, usually referred to as a pixel. And Facebook will have its own cookie that's available on all of these websites. And critically, that cookie will contain an identifier. And this is an area where a lot of people get confused, mainly outside the industry more often than not. The cookie is not storing your name or an email address or a phone number. It's storing a random, uniquely generated number or value. There's no other cookie on earth which has the same value as this. So Facebook knows that every time it sees a cookie with this value, it's the same cookie, and therefore it's highly likely to be the same person. So you can see here that we have a cookie from Facebook with a unique ID in it. And if I was to go and visit websites and interact with them, I could go to Kogan, look at some headphones, it would note that. I might visit the Heinz site and look at some content there, it could note that information. Likewise, if I go to Coles and look at Kit Kats, it's going to build all of that up about me. And you can see that Facebook has now built up this list of interests and linked them to this Facebook ID. So that now when I go to Facebook and Facebook has a chance to put an advert in front of me, it's got this head start on the kind of things that I'm likely to buy because I've arrived with this cookie filled with information about what I'm interested in. And this is what Facebook uses to help decide what kind of content or what kind of adverts to put in front of me. And that's how cookies play a key role in digital marketing today. Now, if there was one slide from this brief presentation that I would ask everybody to take away, it is this slide in terms of the difference between a first and a third party cookie. So this is where things get interesting when people talk about the differences between the two. They may often infer that they're two different things, and this is actually a bit of a misconception. So a cookie is a cookie. What changes is which website you are on when you're trying to look at the contents of that cookie. And it's that change in perspective that denotes a cookie as being first party or third party. So in terms of this diagram here, so we have a Facebook cookie that has been set in the browser, and it has an ID that's against me. Now, if I was to visit the Facebook website, from this perspective, I am on the Facebook site looking at a Facebook cookie. And in this context, it is a first-party cookie. But if I was then to visit the Heinz website, in this context, it is now a third-party cookie. It's the exact same cookie with the same values and the same content. But since I am no longer on the website that the cookie belongs to, it is essentially a third-party cookie. So hopefully that will be an interesting and a valuable point that everybody can recognize as being useful. So if we just continue here. So let's have a look at the example of some third-party cookies and what that loss can mean for you as a business. So to do that, I'm going to talk through an example of what retargeting is, also what information you need to make retargeting happen, and what's changing about how you can access that information as a business, why that's important, and what the impacts are going to be for you as a business. So the first thing to note is that for those of you not familiar with retargeting, a very brief description of this is that if a user visits Heinz and looks at some content, then they go to a publisher site, such as Facebook, we can retarget them with that content and have a continuation of the messaging in order to get that person engaged and bring them back to the Heinz site. That's retargeting in a nutshell. Now, hopefully that makes sense to everybody, but how we like to describe this, from my point of view, is to use the analogy of sending something in the post. So what are the things that we need in order to make retargeting happen? So the first thing that we need to have is obviously the item that we want to send, which in this case is going to be some sunglasses. So we can just stick those in the post box and away we go. It doesn't quite work like that. We do need a little bit more information. So the second item that we're going to need there is actually a method of sending these sunglasses. So we would, in this case, take a parcel, place the sunglasses in the parcel, go down to your post office, stick it on the counter, and away we go. Except we're still not quite there. We're still missing that third most important part of the equation here, which would be the actual address of the of where you need to send this content. And it's the combination of these three items together that allows us to actually send that parcel to me in Melbourne so that I can get my sunglasses. So we can equate these three things in our retargeting to relevant items as part of the retargeting activity. So we have the thing that we want to send, which is the information about what the user's done on site. We have the method we use to send it in terms of the internet. And just as we need to provide an accurate address on the parcel so that Ozpost can get that parcel to me in Melbourne, we need to provide Facebook with some form of address or identifier so that they can take the information you're sending them and connect it to me inside Facebook. And thankfully, Facebook provides just such an identifier in the form of a unique value for every person that visits its website. And this value is what they store inside that cookie. So to just paint that picture again, in terms of how these items link together, we have the item we want to send in terms of our on-site info. We have the method of sending it, the internet, and we have the address that we want to send it to, which is that Facebook cookie ID. We combine the three together and we're able to conduct retargeting. And as you can see, the contents of that cookie are very, very important. So this is where we come to the talk of the impact around what's happening in the industry at the moment. So it's known by many names. It has a lot of different approaches that are being taken by different browsers. But essentially what's happening is browsers are restricting your ability to look inside third-party cookies. So what that means is that you would not be able to look inside the cookie and get the address, which means you're not going to be able to send the parcel, which essentially is going to have a big impact on any particular platform or tools or approaches that you are using that use third-party cookies. So to just clarify that, if you are in a situation where you have a third-party cookie and it is allowed, you can see inside the cookie, then you can use the contents of that cookie to send your parcel to the right place. However, if third-party cookies are blocked, you can't see inside the cookie, which means that we can't see the address, which means we are unable to send the parcel and actually get it delivered. And that obviously is a very big challenge. Now, to put that bluntly for where we are today, this is the current state of browsers as they exist today. Excuse me 1 second to just grab one item. Okay, we'll come back to that shortly. So as we exist today, most browsers have already blocked third-party cookies, but one major holdout for a long time has been Chrome, and their announcement at the start of 2020 has actually caused a lot of these conversations to start to happen. So we are essentially, by the time we reach 2022, we will be a situation where all major browsers are blocking access to third-party cookies. To repaint that for you, just as a very clear picture, that essentially means we'll be in a situation where we can't look inside the cookie to get hold of the address, which means we won't be able to send the parcel to Facebook, which means we won't be able to necessarily conduct retargeting in the way that we do today. And that user would potentially not be able to be re-engaged to come back to the Heinz site. Now, I should point out at this point, I'm merely using Facebook as an example here. This is equally an issue for lots of different platforms, and any tool or platform that's worth its salt, what they will be doing at this point in time is developing methods and solutions to allow them to still get that address to the other end of the pipe in an effective fashion. So for example, Facebook is approaching this by using its conversion API. So you should definitely be investigating that as a potential option. But just to outline the ramp up in speed and approach that this has gone through across the browsers, this is something that's picked up pace since about 2017 when it started with Safari. And obviously other browsers have come online during that period and started to talk about how they are going to restrict access to third-party cookies. And the big one was the start of 2020 when Chrome announced that it would be blocking third-party cookies from 2022. So that really is a big driver for a lot of the conversations that we're looking at today. So hopefully that sets the scene a little bit as to how we've come to be in a position where people are really starting to double down on their efforts with first-party data. So now I'd just like to talk broadly about some of the key areas that we see a lot of businesses needing to look at in order to understand how they're going to approach this. So in terms of starting your first-party data strategy, the first thing is to actually begin these conversations as early as possible internally. These kind of conversations are potentially going to be bringing together groups and teams who have not necessarily worked together before, and getting those working relationships up and running before it comes time to actually make some serious decisions about what you're going to do. It's going to be important. The next is understanding your current data use cases, where they source their data from. So speaking to your internal teams and your agencies and your vendors, where are they sourcing this data from? How is it being used, to really understand what the potential exposure is on a per platform and per channel basis. Next up will actually be to look at the existing platforms and technology you have. As I mentioned before, Facebook is already well ahead of the curve in terms of offering a different method of transmitting the address in this particular analogy. You need to be speaking to your other vendors as well and seeing what they're doing, seeing what they can offer you and what's on their roadmap in terms of preparing for this. And to make clear, this is not necessarily a situation that is now static. There have been many changes over the recent months and years, and there will continue to be changes. And finally, there's the idea of reviewing your existing processes and looking at your existing teams. Depending on how they're using their data at the moment, the changes that are coming could significantly change the way that they have to operate, and they need to be part of the conversation and prepared to make those changes as a cohesive group with the business. So once you've run through the 4 potential starter points that I've just mentioned, you may start to look at exploring alternatives. Now, this information comes by way of a fantastic piece of content that's produced by IAB Canada, where they've broken down some of the example methods that people might choose to approach and looked at the pros and cons of each. There are certainly some alternatives which are not going to be impacted by the loss of third-party cookies. Contextual, for example, as Jess was speaking to previously, panel studies and research, they're not reliant on third-party data particularly, and are likely to be less impacted. But there are other methods which you might look at which could provide a lot more value, but perhaps be a bit of a longer path to get there, such as publisher opt-in using PII data. So building your own first-party profiles using consent data that's been passed over with consent and trust from the user, or looking at sharing your first-party data, perhaps via a safe haven, to link together what you and perhaps a publisher know about visitors in order to conduct more accurate activity. So the final slide from me here is just to say that there's a lot of information there. Hopefully a bit of scene setting has been useful for you, but regardless of the alternatives and the approach that you choose to take, what's needed right now is a consistent and reliable method to allow the connection of data between platforms, which is based on privacy, trust, and user consent. And the IAB's Project ReArc, which I'm sure that Alex is about to speak to in great detail, is a prime example of this. It's a global collaborative effort to bring the right people together with the right skill set to make sure that we're all working in the same direction. And with that, over to you, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really liked the analogy there too in describing the impact, how it works. If we can have all the panelists join us now, please. There we are. I get to see you, Matt.
Yeah.
You're presenting in secret there, so we can see your visage. Alex, you're out in the garden. Lovely.
Sorry if you can hear the crickets.
You're just trying to escape the US politics, aren't you? Just anything to get away from the media. Well, thank you very much. And as Matt's prompted the question there, Alex, it's perfectly set up to check in with you on where we are with Project ReArc. If you give us a bit of an overview and sort of status update.
Sure. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Project ReArc is really, it's meant to be a response by the entire industry, from not just advertising technology, but publishers, advertisers, agencies, sort of everyone in the ecosystem, to think about the changes that are coming in browsers, not only with the disappearance of third-party cookies, but changes in mobile operating systems like with iOS, and changes in how potentially how CTV is even measured and targeted or tracked against. So it's a holistic effort with a lot of participation from a lot of different groups, and we're also intending for it to be global. Now, I realize on the other side of, in a different hemisphere, it's hard to do timing for all of you to join us all the time, but we are doing our best, like Jonas mentioned, to keep him informed. So a quick update on it is that we kind of moved through a phase early on of making sure that we were all aligned on the problems that we were trying to address and sort of the constraints for approaching those problems. So that was a pretty big undertaking, which involved a lot of input from publishers and advertisers on their business activities. We've completed that exercise, and now we've moved into, in the last few months, what we do best, I think, at Tech Lab, which is sort of field proposals and really start tearing them apart. And not in a bad way, but just to get down to the nuts and bolts of how this will work, not only technically, but also could it work commercially. And that is happening right now across two groups. You've probably heard that, Trade Desk has a proposal specifically kind of in the first party data activation space. It's the first one that's kind of taken off out of that side of the group, but we also have proposals coming in around, outside of a singular company's sort of approach to, activating first party data. Like the Trade Desk proposal, we have proposals coming in around how can we create accountability for how those, any identifier that represents any kind of personal data might be used, because we think, and then I'll kick it back over. I don't want to take up the whole time giving an update, but we think that a big part of what we're trying to address here is not just a workaround. If we just create a workaround to the disappearance of third-party cookies, we're really just delaying the inevitable on addressing the real kind of data protection and privacy concerns that individuals have. So we're actually spending a lot of time on going in deep on proposals around technical accountability mechanisms, including like technical audits, but also like standardized logging and all of that, to try and demonstrate that when we do get access to data as an ecosystem, that we're only doing what's allowed and not doing what isn't allowed. So that I think is, really critical to our efforts. And there's quite a bit of activity going on there with, we've got hundreds of companies involved at this point. So lots of progress. It's exciting to see it happen. It can't happen fast enough though. So if it feels like it's going slow, like the consensus process is kind of slow, but we realize too that, we're kind of working against a deadline. So anyway, keep looking to Jonas and the team at IB Australia for updates. We'll like he said, we're catching up regularly to make sure he's informed. So even if we're out of your time zone on the East Coast in the US, you can keep up.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we loop those updates. We loop the Data Council into those updates, the Exec Tech Council into those updates. And I don't think I've told you yet, we're planning a webinar to get an update on Rearc and start looking at the types of solutions that you get December the 10th, 9th for you. So look out for that one, everyone. Thank you. And bringing you in now, Angelo, in terms of Nine and their approach to, really leveraging the scale and quality of the authentic audiences you've been bringing and working on for a while now. From a first-party data perspective, how are you commercially leveraging the assets that you've got?
Look, from our perspective, the journey, and this is probably something for the wider audience, is to understand that it is not a quick journey. Capturing a PI at Nine started at the start of 2016. So if you look at our authenticated users, and it is quite large, across the wider business, that is Nine now, which incorporates the former Fairfax properties. We're standing at about 13 million, but that has been a journey that started in 2016. So probably from my perspective is, that real focus on capturing PI data. I think that's really, really key. And obviously when you're capturing PI data, not everybody on this call is going to be able to capture PI. There has to be a valid value exchange. For publishers, that might be content. For advertisers, it might be some type of light service that's provided. The second point, and again, I know Matt sort of touched on this in his presentation, but it's focusing on the right infrastructure. And a DMP is just one part of it. Most people forget that the data lake and the stitching of all those data attributes, whether it be PI or non-PI, is equally as important. And the third is actually understanding from a commercialization strategy of building your own audiences. It's surprising in 2020 that organizations are still leveraging third-party data audiences or third-party customer segmentation systems whereby they're not that should run in parallel to leveraging your own data. And at Nine, we use our sort of 9 Tries, which is our own built sort of customer segmentation tool, which is 54 audiences over 9 verticals. That's really key. We still have third-party data providers, but we really do have this focus on leveraging our own data. And it's a question I always ask advertisers: do you use your own data to buy media? And most commonly, the answer is no.
Yeah, it's a long-term strategy, a long-term investment, but it can be unique per each partner. And I suppose the way that you guys have looked at it over such a long period of time and invested so heavily into it is a sort of best case scenario.
Yeah, I mean, look, my view is to always focus. And I think I've said this before, the world is becoming, everything old is becoming new again, which is, having started in the direct marketing world where we all lived in a world of PI data. It's interesting that digital has taken 20 years to go back to that. We are all going to become digital direct marketers, whether we like it or not.
See, I knew Wisdom and Age would work for us eventually. So Sara, just to bring you in, as a brand, Kraft Heinz have been focusing on this type of strategy, which is quite unique for an FMCG, if I'm allowed to say that. And can you talk us through some of the foundational work you've done in establishing a CRM database and working out how to manage the signals appropriately?
Yeah, definitely. We're very new to the first-party data world. Traditionally, FMCG companies haven't had access to any first-party data, and only in June this year did we really want to decide to focus on it. And we did this through utilizing and creating a direct-to-consumer platform called Heinz to Home, where we sell directly to our consumers. This is I guess the objective behind this is to drive brand equity and to also collect that first party data and interact directly with our consumers. We've had a lot of learnings already. We're still very much in the growth and foundation phase. We're focusing right now on building our CRM database and capturing that personal information of customers. We are also tagging customers on our site based on their interest, shopping behaviors, and product preferences, which then helps us better target our marketing campaigns to them. We're also creating lookalike segments, which are essentially consumers who possess the same characteristics and behaviors as our customers, and then targeting our marketing campaigns to them to really expand who is buying our products. We're definitely still in the foundation phase. We have only launched about 3 months ago, and we just, I guess, have signed on with a digital agency to help us manage those signals and really manage and grow our CRM database.
Yeah, and I suppose you want to create that sort of virtual circle of activity where one enriches the other, and you keep that sort of positive momentum going.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, so Matt, great presentation. Thanks again. So on that point, in fact, in terms of building out trusted relationships with consumers, how do you what's the starting point? And you touched on it in your presentation, but how do you get them to prepare for the demise of the third-party cookie and be able to build that relationship with consumers as a brand?
Yeah, it's a big one. The way that Alex sort of mentioned in his first couple of comments there around transparency and clarity are going to be key in building trust here. This isn't just a case of figure out another way to get what we want. There has to be a complete mind shift of how we're going to actually allow the right kind of activity to still continue that benefits businesses and consumers equally. Diving into dark patterns and implied consent is only going to lower the trust that you could be building up, and is also going to mean if you take that path, you're going to end up with data that you can't use anyway because it's the wrong side of the regulation. So there's no great reason to be doing that. From a consumer perspective, we really need to be getting ourselves into a place where they can quickly and easily understand what they're consenting to and how that data is going to be used. A challenge that we see with clients quite often actually is encouraging ownership of that discussion within a business, because it is a bit of a gnarly one. A bit of an example at the moment could be someone who maybe is already running a consent platform or tool on their site in order to get people to let them know what cookies are being used for and people opting in and out. Now, the tactical side of that could well be owned by an IT team putting code on a page, But the other end of it, the data that might then end up being gathered is being done by the marketing team, which can sometimes mean that you find conversations where you've got an IT team saying, hey, I set it up how you asked me to, and the marketing team going, why did you let me collect this data? Well, that's not a spot anybody really wants to be in. So you need to cover that crack potentially, and make sure that that it is an owned process from start to finish. The other side of it, really, from my point of view, is once the consent has been granted, the second part of this is really giving your users a solid reason to exchange that useful information, which is exactly where Angelo was going. You know, you need a proper value exchange, which can be used for a user to trust your brand, provide some form of identifier that you can then use as the seed around which to build your profiles and data. But for a lot of businesses, and exactly as Angelo mentioned, this may not be in their DNA. They may not have had to do it before. It could be an entirely new experience. Building out new content and functionality could well mean involving content teams and other teams that are not naturally part of the marketing process. So even once you've gone beyond that point and you now have the data that's coming in, you now need to make sure that you've got the platforms and the technology and the owners who are actually sitting there and going, okay, I know that I've got this data, I need to secure it, I need to make sure I'm privacy conscious, and I need to make sure it's correctly labeled and so on for use throughout the rest of the business. So a lot of different areas to focus on, but they are all equally important. If you have any one of those bits that you miss, you're not going to have a successful time here.
Yeah, no, it's great advice, particularly the joined up alignment across a larger organization. Certainly seen that we've got certain capabilities being run for one tactical requirement, and then strategically other people are sort of replicating that with other solutions. It can cause absolute chaos if you don't get that cross alignment across all the departments and various bits of a large business.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Alex, we're going to leverage your global status and access just to ask, interesting with some of the trends and approaches that Matt mentioned in his presentation in terms of, how to prepare, how to potentially target or segment. But are you seeing any interesting, unique approaches from businesses or any unique insights or trends you can share?
Yeah. So, I mean, to your point, like our view is global. We have now employees kind of across the globe. We have the most in the US right now, but we're in Europe. We're just starting to be sort of in the APAC region. But I'm definitely working globally and have been since before starting at Tech Lab even. I spent about 8 years in ad tech. So yeah, I think what I think is interesting, especially potentially for this audience, is, publishers. I think there's a pendulum swing, right, with what's happening here, because in a lot of ways, the last 10 or however many years of digital advertising have been, advertiser finding their audience for the, potentially the cheapest that they can to really, set the equation right for their ROI. Not that they're buying always cheaply, but that's been the conception. And I think now, because of the potential reduction of cross-site tracking, which is enabled by third-party cookies, right? It puts, it changes the power dynamic a little bit. That's not to say that advertisers lose out. I think smart advertisers will see that and say, okay, which publishers do we want to work with to, activate our data? But the trend though is more around, especially in markets that there are some, I guess, really large scale publishers and not tons of them. So this wouldn't necessarily be true in the UK or the US, but potentially in Australia, Nine's on, and you mentioned the Fairfax sort of being in the family as well. Yeah. The ability to create sort of identity, like federated identity consortiums, like that's happening in Germany right now. There's a solution that's a not-for-profit that's tech called NetID that's powering sort of authenticated audiences across publishers, so that publishers can kind of work together to offer sort of a lot of what advertisers have been used to in terms of buying their audience and measuring cross-site potentially in a slightly scaled down way, but also, at the same time in a way that they definitely know what they're buying on. Yeah. And the publisher, sort of regains a bit of, leverage in that conversation. So that's an obvious sort of business move that requires some technical underpinnings. And I think everything that's been mentioned already in terms of like, you shouldn't be doing this surreptitiously. Like, this should all be transparent and above board to a user. If you're planning, if you're giving users free content, for one, like explaining the value exchange and what you're doing to enable in the example, Heinz or whoever it is to either retarget you or measure the fact that their advertising was effective. So yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting things that I'm seeing is that shift in the traditional digital advertising power dynamic, and then publishers taking advantage of technologies that can safely stitch identities together without having to spray those identities out to thousands of parties, right?
Yeah, it feels like it's more qualitative these days. It's great to focus on quality for all the right reasons, but as well as that comes the challenge of scale and reach. So how you build out that combination of the two from an advertising perspective is going to be an interesting challenge, and the regional differences too will be interesting to watch. Thank you. Angelo, going back to sort of the collection point in terms of data, types of data, what types of data, how do you determine what to collect in terms of what you are obliged to collect and kind of what you want to collect? How does that, how do you work that at Nine?
Yeah, definitely. Look, from my perspective, there's two types of data you can collect. And I know I'm going back to basics here for the audience, but there's obviously the online behavioral data that you collect through the content consumption. And that's been collected for many years. We do all of that, and that doesn't sort of change moving forward. Where the business has changed is around the PI data that we collect. And typically, we're looking at about 6 fields, first name, surname, email address, year of birth, gender, and postcode. And why do we collect those fields? We collect those fields because, in effect, if you look at sort of a year of birth or gender, they're really important segments from a demo targeting perspective. And if you look at sort of the digital media industry, when you start doing the analysis, roughly about 50% of all digital media is typically bought with some type of demo, age, and gender segment. So as much as we have vast amounts of third-party data segments and the like, predominantly most of your data is being bought digitally, leveraging age and gender. So you're collecting data that is relevant to what advertisers actually want. And I think that's really, really key.
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundational part of every brief, right? I mean, that's been the case for a while.
And I will add, there is one point. Just because you can collect data doesn't mean you should be collecting the data. And a really good example, a number of years back, we were debating at Nine the concept of whether we captured a date of birth or a year of birth. And the fact of the matter was, which I sat in a room and said, well, I only need the year of birth to put you into an age segment. There is no need for me to capture date of birth. And I think this is really key. And this relates back to your trusted brand status. Only collect the data that is actually required to provide the services. And that statement should be sitting inside your privacy policy. Most people on this call will find privacy policies sort of hiding away on their particular websites, but it's really key that you actually have that articulated for all to see and only collect the data that is actually required in that scenario. The other thing also, and this is where I think a lot of the digital media industry falls into a trap, most people don't read the Australian privacy principles. And there is a thing in APP3 which relates to sensitive information. So there's a whole series of categories of data you should not be collecting. And I suggest everybody on this call to Google and actually look at what that sensitive information is and make sure your organization is not collecting that. You will not develop that trusted brand status if you're moving into areas that, from a regulation perspective, you're in breach of.
Yeah, I think there's 13 principles within that. And that's I think that's a great point. It's heartening to see that that you making that point, Angelo, in terms of privacy being up front and center in the conversations. Too often it's sort of the thing. I mean, I'll hold my hand up, having been around, so you sort of check that off at the end. You know what I mean? It's towards the end of the execution of a plan or whatever. So having that front and center and thinking about it before you do anything.
And I think this is where social media have maybe sort of a couple of years back got themselves into a world of pain because they were able to collect the information, but they weren't actually thinking about, did they need to collect the information? And I think that's a key question you've got to ask yourself within an organisation.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, for those on the webinar, we will be doing a privacy webinar on the 3rd of December, which you can look out for, and we'll provide, along with that session, a whole bunch of the current state of play, including those 13 principles that we've mentioned, because the questions come through about it. So thank you, Angelo. Sara, in terms of, we've talked about the value exchange and how a brand such as yours, as you're setting up in terms of capabilities, executing the strategy, can you give us a couple of examples of that sort of value exchange that relationship as you establish it with your customers, and how you build that trusted relationship?
Yeah, definitely. The value exchange is a very important part of collecting and gathering first-party data. Our core focus right now is on creating bundles and products that consumers want to purchase. We just did like a limited edition partnership with Collingwood Football Club, where we did Heinz ketchup with Collingwood players on it. And you also got Collingwood Football Club merch. This was a great way for us to establish a relationship with Collingwood members and fans. A lot of them then subscribed to our CRM database, which has allowed us to have an ongoing relationship with them. One of the challenges with growing the CRM database is obviously the opt-in requirement. And for those who aren't familiar with it, consumers have to go out of a way to tick a box to subscribe. However, we're working now on, I guess, limiting that, or addressing that limitation through incentivizing subscription. So as of next week, if consumers sign up to our email database, they'll also receive a discount on their products. And then moving into 2021, we're now working on a range of benefits for consumers signing up, from special discounts to free delivery weekends, to also being able to have their say in what products we offer. We run a range of like surveys on the site right now to get consumers' feedback, but we're really going to open that up to them. And then in the future, we hope to have consumers have their say in our MPD process around what products that they want to see the company develop, also what like pack formats that they're interested in as well. We, I guess, use a lot of third-party data to try and get this information, and use a lot of agencies. But we're really trying to, I guess, internalize it and utilize that. And we've really discovered that consumers love to have their say. We've been overwhelmed with how many people want to give us feedback on different areas, and it really develops that long-lasting relationship.
So what are the methods of engagement? Is it sort of by email? Is it online, through socials? A whole range of different sort of touch points, engagement points?
Yeah, so through email, socials right now. We're looking at, I guess, in the future, whether we try and make the website more interactive and have consumers, participate in like an entertainment hub there, which we can also conduct then gamified market research as well. Yeah, we're really focusing on it at the moment and working out what the plan is.
Interesting, behaving almost like a media owner.
Yeah.
I love the AFL approach, particularly here in Melbourne, for instance. But next time, I really think you should try something.
Yeah, yeah, we're hoping to, open it up to more teams next year.
It's very smart. So Matt, just to check in with you in terms of how you approach your conversations with clients around capabilities, in terms of where to start with the level of investment that's required to take on some of the recommendations that you mentioned earlier. I mean, where do you think they can start to build the internal cases coherently? Where can they look to sort of be persuasive across all the departments, particularly with the bean counters as a starting point?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because for some clients, this can be a brand new venture for them. A lot of times they will have heard about platforms and solutions that are floating around, and maybe under the assumption that they can just take something off the shelf and plug it in, and great, I've patched over and I'm up and running. That is, if for anybody that wasn't clear on that already, that's absolutely not the case. There will not be an off-the-shelf kind of setup here that you can plug and play and say it costs this much, it'll take me this long, and give me 3 months, we'll be up and running. It's much more of a careful combination of process, strategy, and eventually getting into the tools if you're starting to replumb how and where you're placing your data to make sure you get the capabilities right for the business. In terms of prioritizing and securing the budget for those kind of initiatives, the first place that we'd be asking people to look at is around the opportunity cost. If you are thinking that perhaps you'll sit back and start working on this once the third-party data goes away, you're really opening yourself up to the impacts of that for much longer than potentially your competitors will be. And also, once you reach that point of no longer having access to third-party data, it's going to be much tougher to kickstart your first-party strategy. Third-party data is still here at the moment, and it can absolutely be used to kickstart this kind of activity. So provided that you are comfortable with the way it's collected and that the consent is there and so on, you can still be using that to drive the upper funnel activity to bring people to the site, which then means that they're coming up against, as Sara mentioned, the value exchanges, where you're increasing the amount of opportunities you get to actually capture and engage with these consumers. Mm-hmm. And that will form the seeds of the strategy and the profiles that you develop in the longer run. To give like a really useful, well, what I consider to be a useful example of that is we know from discussions of one of the big 4 banks in Australia that they basically took a long look at how much extra they would need to find to invest in traditional media channels to have parity of reach once third-party data goes away, which essentially gave them a dollar figure saying, we're going to need to put this much into TV and radio, for example, to keep reaching the same number of people. And that became the investment amount that they were able to then pump back into the business and say, right, we're going to use that money to invest in a strategy, a process, a CDP, a CMP, all of the various tools that sort of go with this. We could have a whole other session on all the extra 3-letter acronyms that have cropped up as I was trying to solve this. So yeah, along those lines, the next step really is using the knowledge that you've acquired during the investigation process. So if you think back to the 4 steps, the 4 general areas that I mentioned towards the end of the presentation, that's going to give you the lay of the land. That will let you know where to actually start matching things up, so that ultimately it's going to come down to identifying the areas of greatest value that are going to be the most impacted by the loss of third-party data, and use that to set your priorities as a business.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. We did produce over a year ago now, or actually 18 months, I'd say, an ad tech buyer's guide where we sort of gave an introduction to all the platform types and just some fairly general, but we'd like to think sensible advice in terms of how to go about it. So thank you for that. Another quick plug is the impact paper that the Ad Effectiveness Council have put out recently. Very much from a measurement and attribution perspective, some guidelines that have been put out there in terms of the impact of what we'll see by the demise of third-party cookies along the lines of Matt's presentation. So one last question. I'm going to throw it to you, Alex. Just, I don't know if we're allowed a little sneak peek in terms of the types of approaches that you're starting to see. You don't have to name names, but are you seeing quite a wide range of solution-based approaches in terms of, are we going to retain data within the browser? Is it going to sit out on a third-party secure server? Are you starting to see it fall into a few areas? You don't have to name names or go into too much detail.
I mean, everyone's trying to predict this. I think the safest way to say this, but also probably the truest way to say this, is there's not going to be a single replacement to the way that we do identity today. And you think about identity too as not just, retargeting or even attribution. It's everything from frequency capping to, that chart was actually really great. I think he said it was IAB Canada who put that together. Mm-hmm. I think those types of charts are how I've been thinking about this, is like, okay, for what is likely to be the scaled solution in each of these buckets. I do not think that logged in audiences are going to be the scaled solution in any of those buckets. I think they're going to grow. But I think, at the end of the day, users aren't just going to all of a sudden change behavior and start logging into a lot of different things. So I think that won't be a direct replacement. I think one thing that I'm starting to see is that sort of the technology providers that work with the kind of sell side of the equation as we think of it are kind of reimagining some of what they're able to do. You know, the DSPs and ad tech have been kind of thought of as the sort of targeting engines. And I don't think that's going to completely change necessarily, but SSPs now realize, oh, because a publisher is, you know, their audience is now desired, because if they can identify who a user is uniquely in some way, you can potentially build a, you know, site specific or even, you know, consortium specific audiences. So that I think is going to be a pretty decent shift. And I'm already seeing a lot of like SSPs kind of change, not even necessarily change, but like really push on some of the things that they just started pushing on, like exchange traded deals and all that kind of stuff.
Evolving, yeah.
So I think that's going to pop up as not again a direct replacement for, you know, sort of buying audience data from a DMP, but it's a thing that will be a lot bigger than it is right now. And then I think, you know, you asked the question about browser, or I guess what I would call user agent control. That's the $1 million question. Like, I think, you know, Australia has obviously seen a lot of recent activity versus sort of the big platforms. Even today in the US, you had the Department of Justice in the US, you know, taking aim at big platforms. So it, like, yes, there's a lot of activity going on around sort of on-device identity that basically can't leave a device, meaning like it doesn't go to the advertiser, it doesn't go to the publisher, it sits on a device, and definitely doesn't go to any third parties. I think aspects of that are definitely going to take off. Like there's a thing called privacy budget and a thing called trust token that are all meant to kind of reduce fingerprinting. I think some of the bigger things that potentially replace large swaths of what other vendors provide in the ecosystem today are going to be hard pressed to keep pushing forward, saying like, yeah, we should really completely disrupt all of these other businesses while we're under, you know, governmental scrutiny around competition. So like that's again, that's very much even simplifying my own view of it, but I kind of think about it in those general buckets.
Great to get insight. Thank you. And as mentioned, we'll come back to this topic in December with Tech Lab. So look out for that. And that was a good, sensible question to a rather tabloidy kind of question. Well, thank you very much, panelists. That was fantastic. Finishing up with this session, just to mention and a reminder about the information you can find within the data handbook that the Data Council put out recently. And thank you very much again to everyone. Thanks for everyone for joining in. And we'll try and share as much information as possible along with the recording of this session as we can. And I'll hand back to Nat.
Thanks, JJ. That was brilliant. Our poll this morning, the audience here, overwhelming in their request for information around the implications of the cookie retirement and how to get started in this area of first-party data. So your team of experts here have done a great job of starting to give us some information around that. We've also posted lots of information in the chat today. JJ's mentioned the data handbook from the Data Council there. A couple of other resources that are available to IAB members in this area. JJ writes for us a fortnightly Ad Tech Matters article, which has got great information around ad tech, where he'll keep us updated on what's going on through Project ReArc there as well. Another one for IAB members is a policy and privacy briefing that's being written by Peter Leonard, who is a privacy expert from Data Synergies. The first of those briefings is actually available on our website at the moment, and we've got our second briefing coming next week. So some more resources there to improve your knowledge in this area.